Hi there, and welcome to Smith and Sheridan on Biotech, a podcast on the science and business of biotechnology, presented by me, Cormac Sheridan.
And me, Andy Smith. Hello, everyone. Hello, Cormac. How are your kidneys this week?
My kidneys are, as far as I know, okay. But if they weren't, I wouldn't really know, would I?
No, a lot of it is asymptomatic, yes, and we're going to go and talk to that. Sorry about the lead-in.
That's absolutely fine. Kidney disease, it's one of those topics that, in my career at least, only cropped up occasionally as a topic. It wasn't a sort of a major focus of interest for the sort of biotech companies that I would be typically reporting on. And yet medically, this is a hugely important area, and it's getting more and more important. But it strikes me that the sort of genetic lens that many biotech companies have doesn't really properly provide the sort of insights into kidney organ function that are required for successful drug development. I think we're kind of looking at sort of organ physiology rather than genetics and cell biology in terms of trying to come up with ways to slow or arrest the loss of kidney function. And yet that's not to say that there isn't activity, and there is activity, and there's been some, substantial M&A transactions. Most recently, one announced between Vertex and Alpine Immune Sciences, which hasn't been completed just yet. I think they just announced an agreement recently, $4.9 billion acquisition agreement for a lead compound called povetacicept in development for immunoglobulin A nephropathy, which seems to be the sort of indication du jour for anybody who's focusing on kidney failure at the moment. And that's a dual agonist of B-cell activating factor and a beautifully named signal molecule called APRIL, a proliferation-inducing ligand.
Which is in at the moment in a lot of indications, isn't it,
Yeah,
April?
Which is appropriate given that
we're in April.
The month that's in it. So that's reached phase 2, and they have a phase 3 start slated for the second half of 2024. Don't know whether that could go ahead or not under the Vertex banner, but I presume they'll want to move it ahead quite quickly. And say Novartis is also active in the area. They picked up Chinook Therapeutics last year for $3.5 billion, and that brought them 2 compounds also in phase 3 for IgA nephropathy, atrasentan, which is an oral endothelin A receptor antagonist, and that has anti-inflammatory and anti-fibrotic effects. And the unusually named zigakibart, an antibody blocker of APRIL. And by the way, APRIL is a TNF family cytokine involved in B-cell signaling. And Novartis has their own in-house product as well, Fabhalta. I'm probably mispronouncing that. IgA nephropathy, again, is the indication. It's an oral factor B inhibitor of the alternative complement pathway. And it's already approved for paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, but they're now in a phase 3 IgA nephropathy. So that indication alone has a fair bit of focus and interest. And it's one of those conditions that it affects quite a lot of people. I mean, it's the real subset of the universe of people with chronic kidney disease is vast. It's almost about 1 in 10 of the entire human population has either chronic kidney disease, most likely, or acute kidney disease, which is more rare. But 700 million or so people have chronic kidney disease, and IgA nephropathy is one of those conditions that kind of is a lead-in to end-stage renal disease and kidney failure. So it's very important, and also called Berger's disease, and it's a sort of an inflammation of the kidney glomeruli caused by the deposition of IgA antibodies. And yeah, there is some approvals there too. Travere Therapeutics and its commercialization partners, CSL Vifor and Renalis Pharma, they got accelerated approval last year with a product called Filspari or sparsentan, which is a dual antagonist of endothelin-1 and angiotensin-2 receptors. And they got that on the basis of the ability to reduce proteinuria or protein in the urine, but they still haven't got full approval, and they haven't necessarily shown statistically significant improvements in estimated glomerular filtration rate in a longer-term trial. And it's up for approval, I think, maybe later this year. It's a bloody toxic drug, though. It's got a big black box risk evaluation and mitigation REMS strategy because it was hepatotoxicity and embryo-fetal toxicity. So if the kidney disease doesn't kill you, maybe the drug will. Long lead in, I know, but I'll just go through some of the pipeline that's in this area. And as I said, I sort of always felt that this area was sort of unsexy, for want of a better word, but I'm maybe just being a bit blinkered. Medically, it's incredibly important. And I guess pharma's always played here, and biotech is maybe starting to play here a bit.
I mean, for me, the Vertex acquisition of Alpine was leading to a lot of discussion on kidney disease. And if we're talking about IgA nephropathy, or IgA-N, might make it easier for me. But if we're talking about that, then it crystallizes for me the whole issue around not just IgA nephropathy, but kidney disease. It's an anti-inflammatory, right? And anti-inflammatories are used to treat IgA-N, even the corticosteroids. So you get IgA forming complexes which clog up the kidney and stop them doing their normal business. Not only that, but they actually promote inflammation and damage the kidney. And so with whatever drugs we're seeing recently approved or part of M&A or have been approved for either IgA-N or chronic kidney disease, we're almost tiptoeing around the actual disease by addressing the symptoms. And this is the strange thing about kidney disease, because it's not so much a clinical diagnosis. You can go to your GP or primary care physician for years and not have any obvious symptoms. But as soon as they do a blood test and they look up urine electrolytes and find some protein in there or more creatinine than it should be, then it's a laboratory diagnosis. And then you're on this merry-go-round. At that point, a lot of the drugs you've been talking about that either lower blood pressure or lower blood sugar for diabetics with CKD, or tone down the immune system for IgA-N, we seem to be tiptoeing around the cause of kidney disease rather than addressing the symptoms of it, which is fine, right?
There are multiple causes, though. I mean, two of the main causes are diabetes and high blood pressure, and they make up about 2/3 of the cases, according to one of the recent consensus statements I read. And there's a whole bunch of other things. IgA nephropathy was mentioned, lupus nephritis, which is a complication of systemic lupus.
But that's an obvious one, though, right, Cormac? So if you have lupus, then you're going to get immune complexes and they're going to damage the kidney. But it is a sort of chicken and egg situation, which comes first. So if you're a non-diabetic with high blood pressure, do you get eventually CKD? Probably, because the kidneys, and I'm not a nephrologist, but the kidneys filtering blood at a higher pressure is going to hurt them over a long period of time. And then patients with high blood pressure and diabetes, well, that's almost a certainty, right? You're going to get some effect of kidney disease. But again, we're addressing the initiator indications like lupus, like diabetes, like hypertension, and not the cause. It's interesting, right? If you cut out all of those patients that had a risk factor that they're being treated for, whether it's diabetes or lupus or hypertension, how many are left who have chronic kidney disease, and how did they get it? Because if it's not their high blood sugar, if it's not their high blood pressure, if it's not the overactive immune system, then what is it that's causing kidney disease? And could that be a route for drug development?
And I mean, also, of course, typically, we always have these high-income Western world filters on when we discuss the research. But as per usual, the global burden of disease is in low-income and low- and middle-income countries. And there, it can be dehydration and infection can be causes of, say, acute kidney injury. And that can lead on then to chronic kidney disease. And there was a very interesting consensus statement published in Nature Reviews Nephrology this month, actually. And it was a statement, kind of international consensus statement from the American Society of Nephrology, the European Renal Association, and the International Society of Nephrology. And basically, they are calling for greater prioritization for both acute kidney injury and chronic kidney disease from the WHO, because it's not so far kidney disease in its broadest kind of description. It isn't regarded with the same priority as other non-communicable diseases such as heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes, and chronic lung disease. And it is part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to reduce the mortality from these conditions by 1/3 by 2030. I have no idea what kind of progress we're making there. But the same sort of focus and prioritization hasn't come on kidney disease. And this group is calling for that. And they're also saying that simply addressing these lead-in indications, such as hypertension and diabetes, that alone isn't sufficient.
Yeah. So in your reading, Cormac,
yeah,
is it typical that acute kidney injury leads on to chronic kidney disease?
I can't honestly, hand on heart, tell you whether that's the case or not. I haven't checked that because I don't know how easily that's resolved or in how many cases it's essentially cured or how often it leads on to chronic.
I think it's the fact in the developing world, if you have a long period of dehydration, which is likely in those sort of countries, then, okay, you may find some water at the end of it. Then if you don't address that acute kidney injury with some sort of therapy, dialysis, whatever it is, then it can result.
Well, it wouldn't be, yeah. I don't think dialysis.
You wouldn't get that, would you?
You won't get dialysis for acute kidney. I think that's for chronic. But with acute, I imagine it's anti-inflammatories, some sort of way of getting at the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, antidiuretics, all that stuff. It's a complex business and there's a very narrow window of function. If you kind of are outside that window, you can be in real trouble very quickly. So it's a very serious situation. And either way, there's like a big focus, obviously, globally on cancer and cardiovascular disease, because I guess they're the two leading causes of mortality. But chronic kidney disease is the most rapidly growing cause of mortality, and it's third fastest growing cause of death. And it's by 2040, according to this consensus statement, it'll be projected to be the fifth highest cause of years lost globally.
Then you would expect that it would start to achieve more prominence as time goes on, wouldn't you?
And be looked at not simply through the filter of diabetes or high blood pressure, but as its own condition with its own drivers. Because obviously kidney transplant is an extraordinary medical innovation.
Yeah, but still unfortunately rare.
Well, it's not scalable. We have 850 million people a year with kidney disease, and just over 100,000 kidney transplants happen every year. And obviously the cost is huge, and the need for lifelong immune suppression to prevent rejection, et cetera, et cetera.
Although there was that recent patient who was transplanted with an engineered pig heart that expresses human MHC antigens. And then prior to that...
But that's still very, like, how scalable is that, though, you know? So, I mean, it's wonderful for the individuals involved, but as if you're trying to address the global burden of disease, it's not scalable.
And from that tack, although slightly differently, how can we see this problem emerging in Western markets? Well, it won't be in a number of kidney transplants because, as you say, that number is capped. I think you need to look at the dialysis industry, and because that is what happens with patients with end-stage renal disease on the way to a kidney transplant. And if we see those drugs used in patients who are on dialysis, but notoriously that doesn't work that well either, because over the years, I remember reading very early on, patients who were candidates for dialysis or were undergoing dialysis should all have a hepatitis B vaccination because they get blood products, right? And with the best will in the world and as much screening as possible, you might get the odd hepatitis B virus coming through in a blood transplant or a blood product, but hardly any of them did. And then we've had the big issue way back, which probably before your time, Cormac, with the erythropoietin agents, which because these chronic kidney disease patients have low hemoglobin, so they needed some sort of bolstering of that. Yet we had too much of a good thing, and if they were overdosed with that, they had increased mortality in those patients. So we've had lots of fits and starts, and I feel for, as you say, it seems to be a lowly publicised area, but over the next few years, if we start to see increasing issues in dialysis clinics or increasing numbers of dialysis patients, then that will be an indication that, yes, this is having a real effect.
Well, there is efforts ongoing there. I mean, GSK had an approval last year with Jesduvroq. I hate branded drug names. Daprodustat. And that was to treat anemia due to chronic kidney disease in people on dialysis. And because basically EPO or erythropoietin, the hormone that stimulates red blood cell production, it actually is produced by the kidneys.
By the kidney,
so if you've lost a kidney function, you're definitely going to have reduced rates of EPO production, and therefore you're going to have a deficit in terms of your red blood cell count. So this is a reversible inhibitor of hypoxia-inducing factors of various descriptions, and it just results in stabilization, nuclear accumulation of a couple of transcription factors that lead to ultimately, I won't go through the whole rigmarole of the gene circuits, but basically you get increased production of EPO that way. But it was approved with a black box warning due to increased risk of death, stroke, heart attack, and clot formation.
Yeah, ESC, too much of a good thing. But I mean,
and GSK are marketing it in Europe. They could only get the dialysis indication in Europe, and I think others in the same drug class have non-dialysis patients as well.
But it does turn my earlier comment on its head. If we're thinking of drug interventions for kidney disease, be it acute or chronic, treating the symptomatic effects of the disease rather than the cause of the disease. But then, as you pointed out, the cause of the disease is at the kidney where erythropoietin is produced. So it makes you wonder whether all these But
you see, I wonder though, are you being a bit reductive, dare I say it, to somebody who has a scientific lens? I mean, I would think that when you get into a situation where organ function is compromised, there isn't just one molecular culprit that if you work hard enough that you can identify it and intervene. This isn't chronic kidney disease, apart from obviously a few exceptions, is not a monogenic condition due to the absence of one particular enzyme. I mean, there are instances where obviously people with genetic conditions do have kidney function compromised, but that's not the vast bulk of patients we're talking about. So this is the accumulation of organ damage through lifestyle, environment, maybe genetics, poor diet, dehydration, depending on whether you're a wealthy person or a low-income person in terms of, it's just, I must say, it's just life.
Yeah, it's just our kidneys are bearing the brunt of modern life.
And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do more research to try to find other drivers of disease, because you can always find ones that will actually possibly be better therapeutic targets than the ones we have. Obviously, that work should continue. Obviously, I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm just saying, I think the question you're raising, I don't think the pharma and biotech companies are blind to it. I think they're fully aware of all that. And,
no, you're right. I agree. I mean, we treat essential hypertension with drugs that act on a variety of different mechanisms, but we don't know what causes essential hypertension. And that prolongs the life of patients with high blood pressure, which is fine. But it also, again, opening up rather than reducing the scientific approach, it does make me wonder. So what about for high blood pressure, hypertension? Many of those patients go on to develop chronic kidney disease because that increased pressure through the kidney results in damage. But there have been interventions that in non-diabetic patients that address, have you heard of renal denervation, where you actually...
I have not heard of renal denervation.
So there's a nerve...
Tell me about renal denervation.
Well, there's a nerve that goes to the kidney, or nerves in the kidney, that if you ablate or stop functioning, actually reduces blood pressure. And I think it's been approved in some countries, and probably in the US. I think Medtronic have a device that reduces it. But it makes me wonder whether, and therefore, that leads into a lower lifetime instance of chronic kidney disease. It makes me wonder if, even if we're not looking at the cause, or even if we're looking at just one of the causes of chronic kidney disease, if you lower blood pressure in patients that only have essential hypertension and aren't diabetic and don't have other risk factors, then that might result in a lower level of kidney disease. And that might be a start, right? I'm not saying that everyone needs to go and have the nerves in their kidneys denerved, but it'll give us an idea, wouldn't it?
That reminds me that there is a treatment for atrial fibrillation that is reminiscent of that. I'd never heard of the concept, and I think it's fascinating. Electrophysiology terrifies me in its complexity. But yeah, that's very, very interesting. And again, I presume it'll work for some patients and not for all.
I think it's kept for the most resistant to drugs.
Yeah. And what's terribly unfortunate, of course, is that because it is a largely silent disease, by the time the problem becomes apparent, you're already quite sick and you've lost, 85, 90% of your kidney function, and you're kind of going in one direction. And that's a real problem. And there's obviously better screening and more primary care focus, because I mean, a simple urine test will give you your urine albumin to creatinine ratio, and that's one key measure. That's just to measure of kidney damage, because basically there shouldn't be any protein much in your urine, and if there is, that's indicative of a problem. And then, it's a blood test to do your estimated glomerular filtration rate, which is a key measure of kidney function. That is a blood test, but I imagine it's a fairly
it's
standard
routine.
one.
And for full disclosure purposes, I have a slightly higher than normal EGFR, but I have a perfectly
Higher?
normal.
Is that higher? Suggests to me good. Is it? No. Lower. Is it filtration rate? Efficiency of filtration? I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. When
It's
I looked at
measured
the
in a
bar
very
chart,
odd
it was
way.
outside the normal range anyway. But I have a
Okay.
perfectly normal albumin to creatinine clearance ratio. So you're right, Cormac. I mean, it's easy to diagnose, and it's not a clinical diagnosis because there's no pain or no clinical effects for the later stage.
Yeah.
Why don't people who haven't already had them and are at that perhaps 40s, 50s, 60s? You know, we could do that, and then you'd know the extent of the population, or the prevalent population.
I agree with that. But also, I mean, there is good news. I mean, say, if you've had abnormal readings with those two basic parameters, you might go on. The original standard of care was angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers and a low salt diet. But the SGLT2 inhibitors now, developed originally for diabetes, for blood sugar control, they're part of the picture as well. And I think that's very interesting that they are improving outcomes in terms of kidney disease when they're layered on top of the standard of care. So I think that's a real positive.
It's a real positive to the extent that the SGLT2 inhibitors have a mortality benefit in those patients. But again, we're interlacing pathology here. So the SGLT2 inhibitors were designed to remove glucose from the urine, or is it increase
from the
glucose?
Bloodstream? They increase sugar in the urine,
which leads to the complications of higher urinary tract infections, as an aside. But it actually reduces the effect of diabetes in that you have a lower glucose concentration, which is good, right? But also they have a mortality benefit, and they protect the kidney as well. They reduce blood pressure.
So I think that there's some metformin is part of it, statins.
Well, and again,
and our friends, the GLPs are in there too as well, actually.
So it's fair enough. Fair enough. Diabetes comes to the rescue of the kidney in a number of wildly different ways.
Look, it's a huge, huge problem, and there's going to be no kind of magic bullet here. I'm fascinated to see this focus on IgA nephropathy in particular. There are millions of people diagnosed with it, but at the same time, it's a small fraction of the actual number of people with chronic kidney disease.
And both Novartis and I think Vertex describe the two molecules they have for IgA, either in development or under review by the FDA, as products in a pipeline. So they're only looking at IgA-N as a lead into wider anti-inflammatory indications, in the same way as the endothelin receptor antagonists have a blood pressure effect in the first instance, and that will be likely to be their longer-term aim indication.
Yeah, and there is activity. I mean, CSL, Vifor, when it was Vifor Pharma, they bought a Spanish company, Cenefit, from Mallorca, actually, I think, and they're in phase 3 with a calcification inhibitor that's for patients with end-stage kidney disease.
And poor old CSL do need to get something out of that Vifor acquisition, because they bought the company for, I can't remember how much, lots of money. And in Europe, their drug went generic in the space of months after that. And the last 2 quarters have been disappointing for CSL. So while there might be some of CSL's business development people out of work looking for a job, at least they might get a drug out of it at the end of it.
Yeah. And Boehringer Ingelheimer in there, they've BI 690517, a selective inhibitor of aldosterone synthase that catalyzes the formation of aldosterone.
Who this week announced they are looking to be Germany's biggest pharmaceutical company by sales, eclipsing the mighty Bayer.
The mighty Bayer. And then here's another little interesting one for you. Atara Biotherapeutics is going into phase 1 with an allogeneic anti-CD19 chimeric antigen receptor therapy in patients who have systemic lupus erythematosus with kidney involvement or lupus nephritis. So this follows, and I vaguely remember the academic study. There was a pilot study done in academia. 8 out of 8 patients became drug-free and achieved durable remission with an autologous CD19 targeted CAR T therapy. That's fascinating.
It is, but I am skeptical. I'm even more skeptical than I normally am on CAR Ts for immunological indications, because they seem to be refractory to the debate going on for CAR Ts in oncology, where both the companies and the FDA are worried about the resultant lymphoma and cancer cases that come out as a result of the preparation of the CAR T in the years later. But thankfully, those are few patients. But if you open up to a wider anti-inflammatory indication, like lupus, like I don't know, rheumatoid arthritis or something, then we're talking about big numbers of patients receiving engineered CAR T therapy and the potential for that nightmare situation to become worse.
Well, I don't know what the risk factors are, but if you have very serious lupus with kidney involvement, you're very ill. And if this can help, the theoretical risk of lymphoma down the line versus the awful reality of living with a certain condition, these are difficult calculations to make.
Totally agree. Yeah.
And I'm not qualified to pronounce on them, but I guess that's what you're looking at.
Yeah.
So it'll be very interesting to see how the WHO responds to the various nephrology bodies that have made that appeal. I certainly find it persuasive. And if people have access to Nature Reviews Nephrology, well worth a read. And there's also a very good paper. This is from 2022, but there's a new clinical practice guideline for diabetes management and chronic kidney disease. And like the area is moving quickly, and that's why they're constantly updating management guidelines and all the rest of it. So there is a lot going on.
Do the GLP-1s, are they in there yet? Oh, right. Yeah, they
definitely are. And it'll be interesting to see as they cascade through the general population, not necessarily the population that has either diabetes or kidney disease, but maybe people who are a little bit overweight and are taking it for aesthetic reasons. It'll be very interesting to see in time if you can do population studies to see whether or not it will have any effect on prevalence in the wealthy countries where people can access these drugs more or less as sort of lifestyle drugs. I'm not talking about the global situation here, but we're talking about, say, privileged people in the US in particular, I think, where the GLPs have really received massive interest and take-up. I think it's going to be quite interesting to see whether or not that alone will have any knock-on effects. I think there's all sorts of interesting questions raised by their wholesale adoption.
It's interesting, the prevalence of acute kidney injury in developing markets, but not so much in developed markets, makes me wonder whether water should be classified as a lifestyle drug. Let's do the hydration bit because it prolongs your life.
Don't call it a drug. Don't medicalize
nutritional
everything.
Supplement. Water is a lifestyle medical supplement. Stay hydrated out there, people.
Yes, stay hydrated. I think neither of us is qualified to give any medical advice. I certainly wouldn't give any investment advice, but I think I can safely say stay hydrated, folks, is as good a message as we can put out to anybody.
Because my fitness tracker, it has a section down the list, how long you slept for, what your heart rate is. But down there is what you drank today. And I never fill that in. I never worry about that.
Well, my fitness tracker, the battery thing is so rubbish. I'm going back to my Casio watch, but I don't want the system knowing how much water I've drunk.
Oh, yes, good point.
That's between me and my kidneys. On that note, I wish you good renal health, Andy.
Yes, and on behalf of the 4 kidneys on the call today, thanks for taking up our position.
Thanks for listening, folks. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.